that is extremely concerning.
The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has chaired a meeting of the government's Cobra Emergency Committee. She's urged British nationals to leave Ukraine by commercial routes while they still can. The United States is temporarily relocating its embassy from Kiev to the western city of Lviv. Russia has accused the UK and US of a propaganda campaign and insists it's ready to continue talks. All remaining COVID-19 legal restrictions in Northern Ireland are being lifted. The Secretary has questions to answer about how a sex offender who absconded from an open prison in Lincolnshire was moved there after being refused parole 5 times. The search continues for 56-year-old Paul Robson, who's serving a life sentence for attempted rape and indecent assault. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 129 points at 75.31. The pound buys $1.35 and €1.19. LBC weather: rain and strong winds arriving in the west tonight. Tomorrow, rain with snow on Scottish hills clearing eastwards, but persisting across southern England, a high of 11 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Andy Ivy.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Monday night's edition of Cross Question. It's 8 o'clock. Joining me on the panel tonight are Oli Dugmore, Head of News and Politics at joe.co.uk. If you haven't heard of it, he'll tell you all about it in a moment. Vicky Pryce is a top economist. She's with us too. Paul Connew is media commentator, former editor of the Sunday Mirror and formerly deputy editor of the Daily Mirror. And Mark Littlewood is Director General at the Institute for Economic Affairs. They're here to take your calls. The lines are open: 0345 6060 973. And don't forget, you can also watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's crack on with our first question. It's from Cam in Southall. Hello, Cam.
Hello.
Hi, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, so basically, if we were to support Ukraine, attack Russia, etc.
Hang on, it's Russia that's attacking Ukraine, not the other way around.
The other way around. Are we willing to accommodate the refugees, the thousands of refugees that will be obviously trying to come out of Ukraine and into other countries, including UK?
Very interesting question, because I'm not sure we've heard any politician talk about that eventuality at the moment. Vicky Pryce, let's come to you first.
Well, what we've already seen is that other countries in Eastern Europe have tended not to really want very many migrants going into their region. We've seen that, of course, with migrants coming from Syria and, of course, Iraq. But this will be different. And, of course, a lot will depend on where they will think they will be standing if there is an invasion. In other words, the relationships with Russia will still need to be quite good for those countries. They still depend hugely on gas coming from Russia, and also trade. There is a lot of trade going on between, let's say, Poland and Russia and all the other former Eastern European countries. So big question mark. And I think it's a very, very good question that has been put here. I don't think, as you were saying, Iain, that anyone has contemplated that and what they would do as a result. It does make me think that maybe some of those discussions we're having right now, or whatever it is that we're reading in the press, from the Western press, may not be that serious, and they don't expect it to really happen, because otherwise there would have been some contingency plans.
Well, it's also interesting, when I interview people from Ukraine, there seems to be a remarkable degree of calmness about the situation, that everybody seems to be going about their lives very, very normally. There hasn't been a mass exodus from Ukraine up to now. I suppose it could happen. Paul Connew, what's your view?
Well, I have friends in Ukraine who are worried that we're actually overhyping this one. They're a little more philosophical, even sanguine. I mean, they're worried, but they're not quite seeing this in terms of the Second World War looming, or echoes of Munich, as we heard from a normally one of the savviest and calmest of our cabinet ministers, the Defence Secretary. I think it was rather startling, his comparison. But it is a very good question, because no one.
Just on that, is it startling though? Because you see Macron going to Moscow, effectively waving a piece of white paper saying "peace in our time" when he comes back, when it was nothing of the sort.
No, but Macron's got an election not very far away, and I think Putin can see that both Boris Johnson and Joe Biden have domestic problems of a serious nature. So, in a sense, I think Putin sees this as a chance to divide the NATO alliance to a certain extent.
And he's done quite well.
Undermine the EU, and he may be playing a daring but calculated game of geopolitical poker.
Oli Dugmore, joe.co.uk, explain to our listeners, I'm sure most of them do know, but just explain what you're all about.
Joe.co.uk is a social media publisher, and we make political analysis, news, content for young British men. And a brilliant podcast called All to Play For with Joe Cole, which I listen to religiously. I appreciate the plug-in. Thank you very much. So, Ukraine, what's your view? On this point of refugees, I think we already have a pretty clear indication of whether the UK would be receptive or not in what's happened in Afghanistan recently. And the answer is no, really. We're much more culpable for the mess left behind in Afghanistan, and really the numbers that we've taken from there, in comparison to the number of people that want to leave, is appallingly small. We all saw the horrific images of people hanging off the bottom of aeroplanes trying to leave Afghanistan. We haven't taken anywhere near enough of the people that actually want to come here. So if there was to be a significant refugee crisis, I think there's also a separate issue there of whether people in Ukraine would even leave in the first place if Russia invaded. A lot of the noise coming out of there from the reporting on the ground is that people won't leave, particularly in rural areas of Ukraine. They talk about not being able to afford to live in the urban centres of Ukraine, let alone in other parts of Europe. So, yeah, if the refugee crisis was to happen, if people could leave Ukraine, whether or not we'd be accepting of them, I think it's highly unlikely. Do you think anybody in the rest of Europe, let alone in this country, has given any thought to this whatsoever? No. See, that's quite depressing, isn't it? Because whenever there's a war, wherever it is in the world, there are always refugees. And you'd have thought it was one of the first things that governments would do, Mark, to plan for it.
Yeah, but we've planned for this very badly, haven't we? I mean, I thought the first rule of international diplomacy, in which I readily accept I'm not an expert, was to say very little, but to wield a very big stick. Seems to me that the West is saying a lot while waving a twig. Exactly got it the wrong way round. Of course, we should be making these calculations. There isn't a big stick that can be wielded. Well, in that case, say even less. And we should be focusing much more on the mitigation. How many people would we expect to flee Ukraine? I don't know the answer to that. But if we don't have a big stick to wield, we should be considering these humanitarian possibilities. I mean, I'm not sure we need to change the law, right? I mean, if you're fleeing political persecution, we have an asylum system. You need to get here somehow, but if you make it here, we will consider you under the same category that we'd consider people who managed to get out of Afghanistan. You might argue that we should have done more to help those people get out. But I'm not obviously persuaded that our asylum system or refugee system needs policy changing. It just needs practical preparation if indeed we are expecting an influx. But the rules are clear. And it's not, as Oli said, whether you want to come here that's the test at the moment. It's whether you are fleeing political persecution. That's what would actually get you in. There might be lots of people in Ukraine and elsewhere who want to come here. That's an immigration status, not a refugee status. So, I mean, I hope the government is prepared for it, but I would be unsurprised if it isn't. Cam, what would you like to say on your own question?
Really confused now.
That's not the point of this programme. We want to provide clarity.
Simple yes or no. Simple yes or no. Would we allow refugees to come in or not?
Well, I think everyone's agreed we would, yes. But it's a question.
How many? There's the question.
I mean, Ukraine is a very populous country, isn't it? Is it 42 million, I think?
It's the second largest... Well, it's not the population-wise, second largest country area-wise in Europe.
So 44 million people live in Ukraine. Now, I mean, how on earth anyone can hazard a guess at how many of those... I mean, if it all became a terrible quagmire, how many would be able to leave, let alone would want to leave? I mean, that's where I suppose the government planning finds it rather difficult. But Cam, thank you very much. Let's move on to something allied to this. Ravi is in Isleworth. Hello, Ravi.
Yes, good evening, guys. Before I say my question, I'm absolutely convinced if Trump was in power, Putin would not be doing what he's doing. Now, my question is simple. Let's hit the Russians with the pocket. Putin's friends with many oligarchs in London. Let's freeze their bank accounts. Maybe let's start with the Chelsea boss, and he'll be worried.
Well, I have suggested before nationalising Chelsea Football Club, which I'm sure, Oli, you would have a view on.
Yeah, I mean... I agree. I think there's oodles and oodles of Russian money in London. A journalist for Open Democracy, Peter Gagan, reports on this extensively. London is a laundry for a lot of Russian money, and in fact, a lot of Russian money also makes its way to the Conservative Party. They have large Russian donors.
Precisely.
For example, Lyubov Chernykin, who's the wife of a former Russian deputy finance minister, she's donated £450,000
She
to
is a
Conservatives.
British citizen now, though.
Yes, but there are British citizens who are Russians origin and still maintain ties to the Putin regime. So. But they pay inordinate sums to play tennis with Boris Johnson.
I also know she listens to this programme, so I have to.
Good evening.
Yeah.
That wasn't directed at her.
No.
But there are those who certainly are.
I'm sure you're right, but I would say that she is not one of them.
Absolutely. Okay, sure, Ian. But the point on sanctions that I would just make is, not too long ago, the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned. And you may remember that the West threatened sanctions against Russia at that moment in time. The sanctions that we're now proposing against Russia are very, very similar. So you can make the point that if we're just talking in real terms, hard politics, Putin has potentially manoeuvred himself in a position where if he de-escalates in Russia and the sanctions don't come, the West is then going to find it very, very difficult to impose the sanctions they were talking about in response to Navalny poisoning. So there is an element here that if Putin plays it in the right way, he could stand to benefit.
Mark, it is a fair point about all the Russian money sloshing around the City of London. Would that be easy to deal with?
It's difficult to measure it perfectly. I'm sure there is a problem, but I plea for us to distinguish between two things. I don't want us to be anti-Russian any more than anti-Chinese. Actually, I was pulled up on an interview a couple of weeks ago and I was sort of just using Chinese as a general term. Now, I'm opposed to the Chinese Communist Party regime, but I'm not opposed to all of the, the huge population of China. And I think we've got to be very careful that we don't just go anti-Russian. We're opposed to the regime, not the population there. And Ian, that makes it even harder to spot the bad money. If we were going to be as black and white and just say, sorry, no Russian money, no Russian people in Britain, that's it, just on nationality grounds, you're out and we're seizing your assets. I don't know about the owner of Chelsea Football Club. Is he close to the regime? I thought he was an opponent of the regime. I don't know.
It's probably best not to get into that.
But what we emphatically must...
His lawyers are watching.
Yeah, but hang on. But what we joking aside, what we mustn't do is just to brand people according to their nationality or their ethnic origin. It needs to be money associated to the regime that we target.
There are a lot of Russians that come to this country to flee the Putin regime, and yet we are in danger of lumping everybody together.
Well, yes, absolutely, and much the same mistake is made with China. We want to limit the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese population, a good large number of whom are in stark opposition to the Chinese Communist Party. So I think we've got to be very, very clear. This is our opposition to a regime, not a nationality.
Vicky?
I have to declare an interest, I'm afraid. I'm a Chelsea season ticket holder.
and declare your view as well.
I watched us winning the World Cup, whatever you call it, that the other day. Not actually in the UAE, but here. Yes, I think this is an issue. When we say links to the Putin regime, I mean, basically, he runs the country. So everyone who's here has links with something to do with the Putin regime. I mean, it would be quite difficult for any Russian to just completely divorce themselves from whatever is going on out there. So therefore, I agree we have to be very, very careful. But also agree that we've done very little and we probably should have done an awful lot more in the past, not just about Russian money, but about general money that comes in from various sources.
So why haven't we?
Well, I think because our banks have benefited hugely from it and the city has benefited hugely from it, which is extraordinary that we've allowed that to develop.
So if Boris Johnson said, OK, up with this, we will not put any longer, what would he have to do to make a real impact?
Well, he'd have to freeze all accounts of, once you decide who is within that list that you want to attack. So freeze accounts, not allow any money also to be loaned to organisations that have anything to do with the Putin regime, if you want to call it that, which of course will mean that quite a lot of the flow of money going to Russia will be much more difficult to be forthcoming, and also any investments that they have here could easily be impounded, if you like, or is certainly frozen. And we've done that sort of thing before, occasionally when there were some serious issues with individuals where we were really worried about where that money was coming from. So this money laundering issue is one, which at least, we were moving towards doing something about. But what will it mean for the Russians? I think that's the interesting thing for me, because obviously we're seeing already now oil prices going up. That's pretty good news for Putin. And I think personally that he was doing all this to ensure that the new pipeline that he's been very involved in developing, of course, going into Germany, would get the permission that the Germans have so far refused to give him, rather than any serious attempt to get into the Ukraine. Because obviously, Russia will suffer as well, because the trade links are very important. Oil for them is very significant. The way that Putin keeps his population happy is by using this high oil price, or the oil prices generally, and gas. Hasn't managed to get the country to become very diversified at all. So practically what is going on is that money is recycled to the population, which is quite happy with what they've got, because their standard of living remains reasonably high because of it. So if all that is broken in the future, I don't think that's going to be particularly clever for Putin. So I think he's playing a slightly different regime than game than the one which I think the West is assuming.
Thomas on Twitter says, "Why bring my team Chelsea into your panel's discussion?" LOL. It's a simple deflection tactic, because I'm fed up with talking about my team, West Ham, at the moment, and Kurt Zuma.
Well, I'm a Spurs fan.
Oh no, it gets worse.
And we're actually seemingly we're on the market. I'm just hoping that it isn't Russian money that buys us.
I think there is a key point here, Iain, that you sort of alluded to by asking about whether Boris Johnson would do anything about this. And it was the point I was trying to make earlier. I should make clear I'm not just stigmatising Russian money in the way that was perhaps alluded to earlier. There is a significant amount of Russian donations towards the Conservative Party. Is there political will from the Conservative Party to then pressurise other Russian assets, other Russian individuals with sanctions? There's a question there.
I mean, the Russia report has been there long enough, and we've done very little. We've done very little about stepping up the suggestions and proposals in there. It's been largely semantics rather than action.
Well, it's very difficult, though, right? You either have to cast the net so wide that you accept a large number of innocent people will be caught up in it, and you might accept that's a price you're going to pay. You're going to say, we're going to freeze 20,000 bank accounts, quite possibly 10,000 of these people are wholly innocent, but too bad, we're going to have to do it in order to catch the other 10,000. But the history of this on stopping money laundering, we shouldn't believe that the Prime Minister, even if willing, can flick a switch. We've been hopeless at dealing with the mafia for decades.
But if our intelligence services are anywhere near as good as they're said to be, it shouldn't be. Quite. But it shouldn't be too difficult to establish what's dirty Russian money, what's still linked to the Putin regime, and what isn't.
Hugely difficult. As Vicky was saying, there are layers and layers of this.
It doesn't mean to say you shouldn't try and do it.
And on
you need to be
donations,
clear what the criteria are, and to hope that MI6 have a list of exactly the people who are attached to Vladimir Putin, and no innocent Russian is caught in the net. It is nothing like that simple. If it was, we would have been able to shut down the Italian mafia.
But as Iain said, I don't think we're trying very hard.
Vicky?
No, just on the donations front, of course. I mean, there's another reason why nothing very much has happened, possibly. But, of course, that calls for a look again at the whole system. So if we end up with freezing accounts and everything else, then I think, obviously, that's going to create a bit of a hole in finances, particularly for, if we believe that has been the case in the past, for the Tory party. And moving towards a system where you have the taxpayer in fact, funding political parties is going to be a much, much better way forward. And maybe this crisis will get us closer to that.
OK, we'll take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. Oli Dugmore, Vicky Pryce, Paul Connew and Mark Littlewood with me until 9. It's 17 minutes past 8.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:21. Well, we have what I would call a feisty panel with us tonight. Jackie Smith always says I should never use that word because I only ever use it about women. It's not true because we've got 3 men and 1 woman on the panel tonight. Vicky Pryce is here, Oli Dugmore from joe.co.uk, Paul Connew, former newspaper editor, and Mark Littlewood from the Institute for Economic Affairs. Right, our next question is a text question from Sarah in Boston in Lincolnshire. Boris Johnson was seen smirking when asked about Keir Starmer receiving death threats following his comments on Jimmy Savile. 2 MPs have been murdered in recent years. Is this an appropriate way for a Prime Minister to behave? Paul?
Smirking, unacceptable, but there was far worse about Boris Johnson and his Starmer outburst in the Commons, the first outburst, which anybody who has English as their first language knew that was intended to accuse Keir Starmer of personally failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile, which of course was totally untrue and is rife on the dark web and the conspiracy boards. And his failure to apologise for it, let alone his semi-correction, but his failure to apologise, I think, is utterly appalling, but totally unsurprising. The Boris we all know, to him, the word apology doesn't exist in his lexicon.
Ollie?
I have come to expect that kind of behaviour from Boris Johnson. I thought it was pretty classic him. It's how he interacts with journalists. He smirks, he laughs, he jokes around. Now, obviously, he's usually or often talking about very serious things, and that can run counter to the stuff he's talking about. I would tend to agree with Paul that I think the smear itself was pretty reprehensible. I'd echo the point that, yes, Keir Starmer was the Director of Public Prosecutions, but he wasn't personally responsible for the Savile case.
But the argument goes that he was head of the institution. Boris Johnson is expected to accept responsibility for everything his government does.
And Keir Starmer apologised as well.
Precisely. Boris Johnson hasn't apologised, and Boris Johnson was far more intimately involved, from the evidence we have so far, from the report from Sue, that than Keir Starmer was.
Glad you're on first name terms with her.
I think we all call her Sue now. It's sort of a name which was on our lips virtually every minute of every day for a couple of weeks.
Vicky Pryce.
Well, I have to say that I agree. Even though English is my 4th language, I understood perfectly.
That's quite a boast, isn't it?
Absolutely, why not? Chelsea, etc., etc. I might as well say it all tonight. Yes, it was pretty obvious that was intended to smear. And of course, it's correct to say that he was trying to say, you were in charge of the CPS at the time. But it is, I think, the actions after that particular incident with Savile that say a lot, because indeed Keir Starmer apologised.
Do you know what it reminded me of? It's said that Boris had planned this remark. I'm not sure that he did. It reminded me of Boris under pressure in the Commons, what he did as Foreign Secretary when he came out with the Nazanin Radcliffe teaching English in Iran, which was never in any briefing notes. It wasn't true, never in any briefing notes, but he was under pressure, and out it came as an off-the-cuff.
I think you're being very kind there, because it undoubtedly was pre-planned. They'd talked about it in Downing Street. Rumour is that Jacob Rees-Mogg suggested he should do it.
Sunday Times reported that.
But I'm told he was advised against it.
He was advised against it, but he still did it anyway.
And I think Munira Mirza was in the room when those discussions were being had, and it informed her decision to resign.
That's what happened, yeah.
Mark?
Yeah. Well, I agree with that. This was a political tactic, right? The Prime Minister was in a deep hole, still is, hanging by a thread at the time. And this was the famous Linton Crosby dead cat strategy. If you want to change the conversation at a dinner table, immediately throw a dead cat into the middle of the dinner table,
as
and people
opposed
start
to
talking.
Kick one onto the table.
As opposed to kick one. You didn't want to go back to Kurt Zuma, I didn't think.
And we're still talking about it.
And we are still talking about it, but it's
deflected. Calls on it, though, interestingly.
But it's deflected a bit. It did at the time from, will there be a vote of no confidence? Will the cabinet turn on him, and all of that? That was the tactic. Keir Starmer did apologise for it. I think it was over over-personalised in the heat of the debate. But generally speaking, I think the heads of institutions should be responsible for what goes on in them. It might be mitigation if it wasn't my department, somebody junior signed it off, and it might be a more horrific offence if you were personally involved at the time, and there may be a difference. There are obviously huge differences between Keir Starmer overseeing an organisation that decides on criminal prosecution and whether the Prime Minister was at illegal events in number 10 Downing Street, but the person at the top of the institution takes the rap for its behaviour. That goes for Starmer and Johnson both.
And Cressida Dick. He says, trying to prompt someone to ask a question on Cressida Dick. But, I mean, let's throw something else onto the table here. Yes, I think everyone agrees that it wasn't the wisest thing to do. It was a pretty nasty thing to do in many ways. But is it worse than Keir Starmer calling the Delta variant the Johnson variant? I mean, it isn't all fair in love and politics in a way. Ollie?
Yeah, I think, broadly speaking, a lot of the way we moderate politics in recent years, particularly in relation to Brexit, is probably the clearest example, is essentially if someone who you disagree with politically says something fairly inflammatory, you say, oh my God, what happened to standards in public life? Yeah. Realistically, politics is a nasty game, and if you want to get into it, you go into it with a certain expectation. The thing here with the Savile line is that it has echoes of alt-right online conspiracies, and it's talked about a lot on sort of British QAnon Telegram channels, and when Johnson said that, those channels exploded, going from calling Johnson a vaccine shill and, in the pocket of Big Pharma and all this nonsense to, oh, he's one of us now, what a great guy. And you also saw the real-world consequences when that sort of mob of a conglomerate of all sorts of different kinds of protesters were shouting stuff at him. So these words have consequences, but I would tend to agree with you that I think a lot of it you can kind of chalk it up to this is politics, and it does get nasty, and there are going to be personal attacks. I just think we do have to be conscious of the consequences because the words do have real world consequences.
Mark?
Words can have real world consequences. In this instance, I'm not persuaded that there is a cause and effect chain from Boris Johnson's words and, was it about a dozen people outrageously haranguing Keir Starmer. If you actually look at these dozen people, they were attempting some days earlier to replicate the Ottawa Freedom Convoy. They have a range of, let's be polite, rather quirky views about the world. They weren't suddenly pressed into political action.
Let's say they're mad as a hatter.
OK, mad as a hatter. They weren't suddenly pressed into action by what Boris Johnson said.
But it gave it legitimacy, though.
Well, I don't
That's the problem, isn't it?
In whose eyes did it give it legitimacy? I haven't heard anybody say, well, I would have thought that protest was illegitimate, but given that Boris Johnson mentioned Starmer's record as the DPP at question time, it's suddenly legitimate. I don't think it's legitimised it, and I don't think it caused it. And my solution to this, I'm very much with you that politics has become an even more unpleasant sport than it was 20 years ago. There's not enough belief in either side of the fence that the other side you could disagree with, but they might be sincere, well-intentioned people. At the IEA get this all the time. Most attacks on me are not disagreeing with my views. They're assuming that I have ill intent. I don't think this is a healthy part of debate at all. And I think that we've got to be a lot better at accepting that people might disagree with you but not be wicked. However, added to that, I'm rather with you, Iain, there needs to be a bit of resilience here. And I don't think that we can get into a situation in which I think your original caller was sort of saying, is it unacceptable that the Prime Minister smirked? I mean, I think this is going a bit too far into controlling the day-to-day banter of politics. I haven't seen this picture of him smirking. I don't know whether he was just smirking or smiling. We have to accept that we want robust political debate. The bit I'd like changed is to assume, unless there's strong evidence to the contrary, that your political opponent is well-intentioned, merely misguided, not wicked.
So just to be clear, Mark, Johnson echoes a conspiracy theory in the chamber. Days later, Keir Starmer is surrounded by protesters, some of whom are chanting Jimmy Savile's name at him. He's since received death threats, and you're saying that those two things, they're not related. There's been no consequence there.
I don't believe there has been a cause and effect there. Those people who surrounded Starmer were planning. There's a very good article written by my colleague Chris Snowden about this. They're the precise people. You can track their movements. This was planned days before Prime Minister's questions.
They're there most of the time, but the Savile smear against Starmer wouldn't have happened if Boris Johnson hadn't made that.
Well, I've just been told it's alive and well on the dark corners of the interweb. These people are the people who populate those dark corners of the interweb. That's where they came from. They didn't suddenly stumble across this at Prime Minister's questions. They were soaked. I mean, they're anti-vaccine. They believe
I think they were emboldened by the Prime Minister repeating their lines.
They were all planning to come to London prior to PMQs.
Well, I would say that, yes, politics has been sort of seriously debased over the last couple of years, but I would suggest that the Savile blow, if you like, was one that even the population didn't like. I mean, you've seen quite a lot of reaction to this because, of course, all the things that he's brought back, and it just seemed to be too personal and sort of too nasty an attack. Even though you could argue that he was, possibly in the minds of Johnson, justified.
What we really want to know is what are the three languages that precede English in your list?
It was Greek, I'm afraid, which is where I was born, then French, which I grew up with, and then I went to a German school, so it was German.
Any ones below number 4?
No, that's it, I'm afraid. I tried a bit of Italian and Spanish, but gave up. No time.
Right, we're going to move on to a very heavyweight subject in just a moment, but before that, let's get some news headlines with Andy Ivey.
Boris Johnson and President Biden have agreed a crucial window remains for diplomacy and for Russia to step back from its threats towards Ukraine. They've spoken by phone this evening and warned Moscow an invasion would result in a protracted crisis for Russia. Northern Ireland will remove all remaining legal COVID restrictions tomorrow. Health Minister Robert Swan has announced the rules, including wearing face masks in public places, will be replaced by guidance. A sub-postmaster says he contemplated suicide after wrongly being accused of false accounting. Baljit Sethi has given evidence on the first day of an inquiry into the prosecutions of more than 700 branch managers following flaws in an IT system. LBC weather, rain and strong winds arriving in the west tonight. Tomorrow, rain with snow on Scottish hills clearing eastwards, but the rain will persist across southern England, a high of 11 degrees.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:35. I'm loving this panel tonight. A lot of you are too. Oli Dugmore is here, Head of News and Politics at joe.co.uk. Economist Vicky Pryce, Paul Connew, former newspaper editor and now media commentator, and Mark Littlewood, Director General at the Institute for Economic Affairs. Ben in Clacton has a very heavyweight question coming up. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Ian. You
Hi.
were talking about ethics earlier. Is it ethical for big fossil fuel companies to have lobbyists trying to delay the measures that are going to bring about climate change and the morality of the profits of £900 per second? And is it ethical to do that? Because thousands of people may die because of their lobbyists lobbying to delay climate change.
Are you saying that
measures.
fossil fuel companies shouldn't be allowed to have lobbyists, and yet everybody else should? Wouldn't that be unethical?
Well, it depends what they're lobbying for. If you're lobbying to cause the deaths of thousands of people in low-lying countries...
nobody lobbies for that.
Well, that's what they're doing. That's the result of their lobbying. If they're delaying the measures for climate change, then that's the result. It's inevitable that that's the result. There was more lobbyists there in COP than there was from the countries that will be affected by climate change.
OK, Vicky Pryce.
I think that's quite true, what went on at the COP. But also, of course, what is true is that fossil fuels receive still, many more subsidies than renewables. So we have a long way to go before that can really change in such a way that we can be certain that whatever it is that we use for electricity and energy more generally comes from renewables. I'm afraid for quite some time we're going to be relying on oil and gas, and we've seen this right now with what's going on with the crisis in the Ukraine. And also the transition period is going to be a very expensive one for everyone. Look at the cost of living issues that we've got at present. Right. The truth is that we are going to need to depend on gas for quite some time. The question for all of us is how you can balance that transition in such a way that it doesn't sort of kill us in the meantime, by which I mean financially and economically. So we still need, I'm afraid, fossil fuels. We are going to need them for quite some time to come. So in a way, those lobbyists are there partly explaining it. But I'm afraid we've also got a government which is now relying heavily in order to improve some of its fiscal sort of position on taxes that it imposes on people who use fossil fuels. So petrol, for example, is mostly taxed, frankly, or a lot of it is. They haven't raised fuel duty, but they still collect an awful lot from that. They haven't raised it for the last 12 years. But there is a huge percentage of what they get into the Chancellor's coffers, which comes from, I'm afraid, taxing fossil fuels. So if you stop that entirely, or much faster than perhaps the Chancellor would like to see it at present. And he did actually say that we needed gas for quite some time to come. If you stop that, then other taxes will have to rise. So as citizens and taxpayers will have to perhaps decide whether we're happy with that.
George on a tweet says, nowadays lobbyists hide behind think tanks, Mark Littlewood. It's all your fault.
It's all my fault, is that?
As usual.
Well, you won't be able to pay the IA to lobby for anything other than free markets. So we're ideological. We're not like hiring a lawyer who will take a case, whether, whatever your particular predilection is.
I think what he means is that if Esso said, we'd like to sponsor a seminar with you, Mark, you're not going to turn them down, are you?
No, well, then their name would be on it. I mean, I have to raise money to keep the IA alive. I mean, the difference between us and what I think is usually meant as lobbying is a lobbyist company, a bit like a law firm, will say, we've got people who can put your case in the court of public opinion or in court. We take no view on what it is you're looking for or what ideological position you're coming from. We will just put your case, and you can hire public affairs agencies to do that. You can't hire the IEA to do that. We'll only argue in favour of free markets and a smaller state. And if you doubt that, then George, was it, try and give me some money to stand up for communism, and you'll find that your cheque is sent back to you. But the lobbying's quite interesting because it's become one of those words that everybody's against lobbying, but nobody can really define define it. I think I'm in favour of lobbying.
But it's the ultimate sign of democracy.
Exactly. The most important part.
What about paid lobbying, though?
Well, that's absolutely fine as well. It's like paid lawyers. I mean, presumably your initial caller, Ian, if BP are in court or SO are in court, are they allowed a legal defence or no? Because these are the bad guys, so they can't have lawyers either. I think they should be able to have paid lawyers, paid lobbyists. Central lobby is, I think, the most important part of Parliament, called central lobby. The idea is that you march in and insist that you wish to lobby your MP. A healthy democracy with decent debate requires that people can put their case forward, not necessarily themselves, for the same reason that we don't insist you have to defend yourself in a court of law. You can hire a lawyer to do so, and the same applies to companies, campaign groups, anybody else. If you want to hire a lobbyist to put your case forward in the same way you would hire a lawyer, go for it. There are rules covering that, strict rules about declaring it and what your interests are and the rest of it. But I say the more lobbying, the better. It adds to public debate, and I want to hear every side of the argument. Fossil fuel companies, renewable companies, the whole lot.
OK. Paul?
Well, actually, for once, I feel a bit sorry for Boris Johnson because, on principle, I am a staunch climate change supporter, but how, with the looming cost of living crisis, forgetting about Ukraine for a second, how he's going to get anywhere near delivering his targets on climate change and a green economy is a huge, huge challenge. And of course, he's got a Tory party who are split down the middle on this. And it's going to be, in domestic politics terms, it's going to be the, apart from Partygate's outcome, it's going to be the big issue at the rest of this Parliament.
But going back to Ben's question, is it ethical for these companies to delay climate change measures through their lobbying?
I don't object. I think paid lobbying is different, and I think any MPs who should not be paid at all by lobbyists. But I actually don't mind lobbying as long as it's totally above board, as long as it's transparent, and as long as parliamentarians are honest about whether they are representing or being influenced by lobby firms. Let alone they must not be paid. But I think any form of paid lobbying is totally beyond the pale.
Oli,
I think the original nub of the question there was about transparency. I think it's about declaring on whose behalf you're lobbying. I think the question for Mark is, as a lobbyist, I think the British people are entitled to know whose interests you have at heart. Do you have theirs or the people who pay you? And I don't think right now there's really any compulsion for institutions like the IEA, who itself is, I believe, registered as a charity, which I find quite peculiar, but other organisations as well. They're not currently compelled to explain where their funding comes from, whose interests they have at heart. And I think that's a fundamental, really deep sickness or rot within our politics.
Well, Mark, as you know, every time you come on this programme, I get texts and tweets from people saying, ask him who funds the IA since Oli's brought it up. I always say to people, I'm not going to ask that question every time because it's just boring. But I restrict myself to asking it once a year. So go on.
Well, we're funded by we have a pie chart on our website. By recollection, I haven't looked at it for a while, about 70% of our donations are from individual donors, about 10% or so from institutions, about 20% or so from companies. We do not insist that any of those put their names in the public domain.
Why wouldn't they, though?
Well, I mean, a range of reasons. Let me give you one example, and I won't name him. A generous donor of ours said, I don't want to be listed in the public domain. We did all of our due diligence on him. He says, I don't want a plethora of other groups like the IEA coming and asking me for money, and I don't want to receive a whole load of abuse for giving you money. Here is a private donation. And there is a distinction here. I think money for causes. And if anybody wants to suggest that the IEA, over its 60-plus years of existence, has not been painfully loyal to free markets as an ideology, you can't pay us to take an anti-free market position. We're not like a lobbying firm in that regard. It's like giving money to a cause. If you give money to Greenpeace, I'm sure that's to promote environmentalism, or Oxfam to lower charity, or the Church of England to increase the spread of Anglicanism, is rather different to going to a communications company, much similar to a law firm, in which you say, I've got this particular problem and I want you to try and stop clause 106 in this bill. That's a rather different thing. And I don't think that the IEA should be any more obliged to list its donors. We give a breakdown on it and say, if anybody doubts it, try to give us some money to promote something that isn't free market, and you'll find your cheque sent back to you. So we're ideologically consistent, unlike a lobbyist firm. But why the IEA any more than the Church of England, for example? Less transparent on donations than we are. They pipe up all the time about politics. Or the British Board of Jewish Deputies. Do we think their list of donors should be in the public domain? What could possibly go wrong?
I mean, it's a very compelling answer, but you haven't answered the question, which is who funds you. You haven't named a single
Well, I told you why I won't answer the question. I don't believe that organisations...
isn't it?
Well, I don't think it is revealing. Do you think the list of donors to the British Board of Jewish Deputies should be listed in the public domain?
Are the British Board of Deputies lobbying government ministers on this, that and the other?
Yes!
In the same way that you are in quite a
more so. I mean, much richer than we are. The Church of England, for example.
Yeah, absolutely, of course.
The Church of England, much more than we are. Hugely more access, the Archbishop of Canterbury, than I've got.
Mark, do you invite your...
Hang on, Vicky wants to
I was going to change the discussion a tiny bit, because what we talked about ethical lobbying, whether it's ethical at all. If you're presenting evidence which is based on fact, and you're not trying to get a decision to be made which will indeed be very, very bad for the world, the economy and so on. I mean, and there had been all these problems with pharmaceutical companies in the past that have been exposed and so on, cigarette smoking and so on, where, obviously that lobbying that was taking place at the time wasn't representing the true facts or possibly even suppressing some of the evidence that was out there.
No doubt.
I mean, that's a real problem. So it all depends, of course, what types of lobbying we're talking about. Now, that moves away from how the IEA is funded and what type of lobbying you will do. And I do apologise for having stopped this really interesting discussion. But I just thought I'd go back to the question. Ethical is when you're doing your lobbying but using the right evidence and not distorting the facts to suit you, which I think is what happens, I'm afraid, rather a lot.
OK, we'll move on in just a second. It's 8:47.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 10 to 9 on LBC. Oli Dugmore is here, Head of News and Politics at joe.co.uk. Economist Vicky Pryce, Paul Connew, former newspaper editor, now media commentator, and Mark Littlewood from the Institute for Economic Affairs. A text from Dave in Coventry, who says, with Unite threatening to stop funding the Labour Party as a result of the Coventry bin strike, can Labour really continue to claim to be the party of working people? Now, this is quite interesting because Keir Starmer was quite, for him, volcanic in his reaction to the threats from Unite to stop funding. I mean, he was very, very strong on it. Ollie, what's your view on this?
Dare I say it's Scargill-esque in the way he responded to that threat from the union. No. Labour faces a serious problem with its finances. Its membership is declining, which previously was a source of a lot of income. Rachel Reeves described that as a good thing. I'm not sure whether their accountants would agree with them. And unions as well. And I guess it points to the broader question about the political redirection of the Labour Party under Keir Starmer. Unions like Unite, previously in various guises, depending on which union you're talking about, quite closely aligned with Jeremy Corbyn's political project. Keir Starmer has moved more towards the centre, and now the unions are playing hardball and threatening to withdraw their funding. I do kind of back Keir Starmer's response to say if that's how you want to be, then I can fight fire with fire. But yeah, it's a serious problem that should give them cause for concern.
Because the Labour Party has been shedding staff hand over fist over the past few months, hasn't it? And I mean, and if you want to fight an election, and an election is probably 18 months away, it could be a bit longer, possibly less. You're absolutely right. You've got to have the machine, and if you haven't got the money, you can't have the machine.
There's another aspect to that as well, which is obviously the ginormous groundswell of grassroots activists that Jeremy Corbyn brought into the Labour Party. Say what you want about their politics, people like Momentum, etc. They had an army of people out knocking doors for the Labour Party. Those people aren't doing it now for the Labour Party under Keir Starmer. So, yeah, there's serious electoral questions about campaigning that are being raised by this.
So for him, it's got to be an air war rather than a ground war.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, whether he thinks that's effective or not, I'm not his campaign director, so it's not for me to say.
Yeah, who knows?
Ian, I think it's highly unlikely that job offer is going to come through. Yes.
Paul.
Well, I've got family in Coventry, so I know how much the bin strike is a burning issue. But actually, ultimately, I agree with Vicky. I think we need state funding of the political parties, but obviously that's if that's ever going to happen, it's certainly not going to happen before the next general election. So Labour have a finance problem, but I think Starmer has taken the only position he can stand, and he has to cross his fingers and hope that ultimately, unless Labour supporters, including Momentum, want to see either Boris Johnson or his successor in number 10 after the next election, whether it's in 18 months' time or it goes the whole length of this Parliament, then they're going to have to get behind Starmer, even if they're holding their noses, just in the same way that a lot of Tory MPs held their noses when they voted for Boris Johnson as leader.
But the question is, can Labour really continue to claim to be the party of working people if they don't support the strikers in Coventry? Now, it's a Labour council in Coventry, so you can see that Keir Starmer would be conflicted about that. But there was a time, not that long ago, when Labour would have automatically supported the workers. And yet you look along their front bench now, and how many of their front bench, with the exception of Angela Rayner, could you say actually come from a working class background? Very few.
I think that's absolutely right. In fact, the backbenchers are rather different. But Angela Rayner is probably the only, if you like, traditional working class MP, and she can be very effective. And I think if Labour played their cards right, rather than having Starmer and Rayner often at loggerheads, if they played it as a team with her as the street smart, street savvy, plain talking element, and Starmer as the more sophisticated, slightly more genteel in his approach. But you're right. Labour have this dilemma. But I think on the bin strike in Coventry, it was a close, hard call for Starmer, but I think he's taken, on balance, the right move, because Labour are not going to win this without doing what Blair did and attracting and certainly winning back the red wall seats.
OK, Mark?
I think Labour's become, broadly speaking, a middle-class, liberal, metropolitan party. I don't say that in a damning way. I consider myself a middle-class, liberal, metropolitan kind of person. But I think we should distinguish between the working classes and the trade unions. These are slightly different things. And although I don't have the facts at my fingertips, Iain, private sector membership of trade unions has collapsed over the past couple of decades or so.
Actually,
and I think
trade union membership is gradually going up.
Well, it may be, but if you were to look back at the 1970s, say, the trade unions would represent quite a large number of workers in the private sector. That's sort of no. So the trade unions, by and large, now public sector workers. Fine. I mean, they have every right to lobby and express their interests. But private sector working class people, well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's up to Keir Starmer to select his strategy. At the last election, the one seat that switched from Conservative to Labour was Putney. I think average household income £80,000 a year, whereas if you looked at all the seats that switched from Labour to the Conservative, kind of traditional working class areas, I don't know how he puts his coalition together. He needs a mixture of things, as you always do in politics. You need popularity, you need to be good on the airwaves, you need to raise money, you need to persuade foot soldiers, which Jeremy Corbyn did extremely successfully. The Labour Party would have outgunned the Conservatives on the doorstep at the last two elections. And I just wonder whether Labour is going to completely reinvent itself as a middle-class Liberal party rather than a working-class one.
Caroline is pointing out that Keir Starmer is from a working-class background. His dad was a factory worker and his mum a nurse. Well, it's very true. I don't know if anybody's seen the communications workers Valentine's video today. It's very, very good. It's trying to recruit people. With Dave Ward, trying to recruit people from the private sector. It's worth a look. It's
that's what they should really focus on. Trade unions. There's a big market there.
Yeah.
Vicky,
I just think the problems are going to get worse, and Keir Starmer will have to decide which way he goes, and indeed, which bit of the population, perhaps in different places, as we know, you appeal to different groups, really, which is what most savvy parties do. But we're going to get this cost of living crisis becoming even worse for quite some time, and the public sector is where most of the hurt will be, because that's where we have pay restraint still, and the government is simply not going to allow that pay freeze to really dematerialise. So there's going to be an awful lot of that, and what they do on this, I think, will determine very much, I suspect, the chances of them getting elected next time.
Well, I did mention Valentine's Day. Luke in Ealing is texting this. Are you prepared for this? It's Valentine's Day. What's the worst date you've ever been on?
Oh, God.
Who wants to start off with this?
Well, we didn't have Valentine's celebrations at all in Greece, so I'm opting out of this.
No, but you've been on lots of dates, Vicky.
Yes.
I don't mind humiliating myself with an anecdote. When I was at university, I took a girl out on a date, or she took me out on a date. I can't remember which way round it was. And she began dinner by saying, "Mark, you remind me of a 1950s Hollywood film star." And I rather put Cary Grant, Robert Redford, who might it be? No, it wasn't Cary Grant, wasn't Robert Redford, wasn't Paul Newman. And suddenly over dessert, she remembered the movie that I reminded her of. She said, "No, I've got who it is. Pinocchio." That was the 1950s film character.
I thought you were going to say Charles Hawtrey or something.
Not quite that bad, but nearly as bad. Got my hopes up too high.
Well, many, many years ago, I went on a Valentine's date in a Greek restaurant
I met Vicky.
Where dancing exuberantly and
on the tables,
doing the traditional smashing. Yes. I smashed it over my date's head and cut her head open, which was not the...
Good.
Okay, it was Valentine red,
and
but
please
not
say,
but
and
not
then I married her.
Yes.
Did you then go on to marry her?
No.
Okay. Ollie, we are waiting agog.
I didn't even get as far as a date, actually. When I was at school, there was a girl I fancied, and I bottled asking her out at the bus stop in front of everyone, and she started walking off, and I ran after her, big sort of romantic gesture, and asked her out, and she said no, and I then had to walk back to the bus stop, and everyone was like, "What did she say? What did she say?" All of my school were up there, and I was like, yeah, she rejected me.
Ultimate humiliation, isn't it, when they say no? Hope nobody's had that experience today.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Robbie wants me to tell mine, not on your life. In fact, we've run out of time.
Very wise.
Oli Dugmore, Paul Connew, Vicky Pryce, Mark Littlewood, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Tomorrow on Cross Question, we're having an international special. 4 experts on foreign policy, international issues, so do prepare your questions for that. In a moment, we're going to be talking more about Ukraine. What should be done? What should our reaction be if the Russians do invade this week, as the intelligence seems to suggest that they will? If they do invade, What then? 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From